Welcome back to the Acceptance Project podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bryan Gross. Every now and then, there are conversations that are uncomfortable to have, but they're too important to ignore, and today's conversation is one of those. When most people hear the phrase elder abuse, they immediately picture bruises, neglect, or some dramatic story they saw in the evening news. They might even imagine it happened somewhere else, to someone else, in a place far away from their own family or community. The truth is much harder to accept. Elder abuse often happens quietly. It happens behind closed doors. It happens in families, in neighborhoods, in care facilities, and sometimes even in the lives of people we know and love. It happens to people who have spent their lives caring for others, teaching children, maybe even showing up for the people around them. And maybe the most heartbreaking of all, many older adults suffer in silence. Now, as we recognize World Elder Abuse Awareness Day on June 15th, I want us to look beyond the headlines and statistics. I want us to talk about something deeper. I want to talk about dignity, belonging, and what happens when people begin to disappear in plain sight. Because elder abuse is not only about physical harm, it's about isolation. It's about vulnerability, connection. And as many of you know, one of the topics I've been speaking about more and more recently is the concept of shrinking. Not physically shrinking, but socially and emotionally shrinking, becoming smaller in the world because the world no longer seems to notice you're there. So today we're going to talk about how that happens, why it matters, and what each of us can do to create communities where people continue to feel seen, valued, and protected throughout every stage of life. Years ago, I had the privilege of delivering a keynote presentation at the Kentucky Elder Abuse Conference. I remember preparing for that event and expecting to learn about investigations, legal issues, reporting requirements, and the practical side of protecting older adults. And certainly those topics were discussed. But what stayed with me, it wasn't a law, a policy, or even a statistic. It was the stories. Story after story about people who had once been deeply connected to their families, churches, workplaces, and even communities, and then suddenly found themselves alone. Some had lost spouses, while others experienced declining health. Some had moved into care facilities, and some had just simply outlived the people who had always been part of their daily lives. What struck me then, and still strikes me today, is that abuse often begins long before anyone notices obvious signs. It begins when people become disconnected, when fewer people check in, visit, ask questions, or when fewer people notice. And that is where today's conversation begins. Now, before we begin, jumping head first into today's discussion, I want to tell you a story about Margaret. Now, Margaret had recently moved into a senior living community after losing her husband of 58 years. Like many people facing a transition like that, she was carrying more than a suitcase. She was leaving behind the home where she had raised her children, the neighborhood she knew by heart, and the routines that had shaped her life for decades. Everything familiar was gone, and she arrived hoping to find connection, friendship, and a sense of belonging in this new chapter of her life. On her first day, Margaret walked into the dining room and noticed a table where 4 women were laughing and talking together. Gathering her courage, she approached them and politely asked if she could join them. One of the women smiled and said, "Well, actually, these seats are saved." Margaret nodded and smiled back and found another table. The next day, she tried again at a different table. The response was much the same. Day after day, she found reasons why there was never quite enough room for her. Before long, she realized the seats weren't really being saved. The message was clear without anyone ever saying it directly. She wasn't welcome. Weeks turned into months. No one called her names. No one threatened her, no one raised their voice or treated her with obvious cruelty. Yet every day she found herself eating alone. When activities were organized, no one thought to invite her. When groups gathered in the common areas, conversations often seemed to pause when she approached. Slowly, she stopped trying. The effort of reaching out began to feel more painful than the loneliness itself. Staff members eventually noticed changes, of course, but Margaret attended fewer activities. She spent more time alone in her room. The woman who had arrived hopeful and eager to make friends became increasingly quiet and withdrawn. One staff member later described it as watching someone slowly disappear. It wasn't that Margaret had changed overnight, it happened gradually, one small rejection at a time. When someone finally asked why she never reported what was happening, Margaret's answer was heartbreaking. In its simplicity, she said, "I don't want to make a fuss. They don't really like me, and I can't make people like me." The truth is that nobody physically harmed Margaret. Nobody stole from her. Nobody openly bullied her in a way that would make headlines. Yet every day she received the same message: "You don't belong here." After hearing that message often enough, she began to believe it herself. That's what shrinking can look like. Not all at once, not through dramatic acts of cruelty. Sometimes it happens one empty chair at a time. And sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one else can see. Now, the powerful thing about Margaret's story is that the solution isn't complicated. It doesn't require $1 million program. It requires people who choose connection over comfort. For the residents, the answer could have been as simple as one person sliding over and saying, "There's room here." One invitation to join a card game, one knock on her door before an activity, maybe one person introducing her to others. The residents who were already part of the social circle had something Margaret desperately needed. That's access. They held the key to belonging. They didn't need to become her best friends overnight. They simply needed to make room at the table. Every resident in a senior community has the power to notice who is always sitting alone, who never gets invited, and who seems to be fading into the background. Inclusion is often nothing more than an intentional invitation. Staff have an equally important role. Instead of simply observing that Margaret was becoming withdrawn, they could have viewed social isolation as a risk factor requiring intervention. Staff can intentionally introduce new residents to others with shared interests. They can create buddy programs, welcome ambassadors, and small group activities designed to help newcomers build relationships. They can monitor not only physical health, but social health. If someone consistently eats alone, rarely attends activities, or spends most of their time isolated in their room, that should raise the same level of concern as other indicators of declining well-being. Now, most importantly, staff can create a culture where belonging is everyone's responsibility. In many senior communities, policies exist for falls, medication errors, and even emergencies, but there are few systems in place to identify social exclusion. Imagine if communities tracked belonging with the same seriousness they track other measures of resident well-being. Imagine if staff regularly asked, "Who has friends here? Who feels connected? Who feels welcomed?" Those questions might reveal problems long before someone begins to shrink. The real answer for Margaret is that she needed visibility. She needed people who noticed, because shrinking doesn't happen when people are seen. It happens when people become invisible. The opposite of shrinking isn't simply participation. The opposite of shrinking is belonging. What Margaret needed wasn't a new dining room. She didn't need a bigger apartment. She didn't need another activity on one calendar. What Margaret needed was one person who looked across that room and saw an empty chair, not as a place to avoid, but as an opportunity to welcome someone in. Because sometimes the difference between belonging and shrinking is nothing more than a chair, an invitation, and someone willing to say, "Hey, come sit with us." Now, when people think about elder abuse, they usually think about physical violence. The reality is that physical abuse is only one piece of a much larger picture. One of the things many people don't realize is that financial exploitation is one of the fastest growing forms of elder abuse in America. According to researchers and advocacy organizations, older adults lose billions of dollars every year to scams, fraud, exploitation, and financial manipulation. But here's something many people don't know. Most financial abuse isn't committed by strangers. It isn't the older person falling prey to that email we've all gotten about a prince in some other country who would like to deposit millions of dollars into your account and you can keep a percentage for being so kind to help him. It's committed by people the older adult knows: family members, friends, neighbors, trusted caregivers, the very people who have access to their lives. That's difficult to hear because it challenges the image we want to have of family. We want to believe the people closest to us are always acting in our best interest. Unfortunately, that isn't always true. Sometimes it starts small, maybe a borrowed credit card, maybe a check written for a larger amount. There's always that promise to pay something back later, and then one day someone discovers savings accounts have been emptied, Retirement funds have disappeared or property has been transferred. The damage isn't only financial, it's emotional. Imagine spending 70, 80, maybe even 90 years building a life only to discover someone you trusted took advantage of you. The financial loss hurts. The betrayal cuts even deeper. But here's the second thing many people don't know about elder abuse. Research consistently shows that social isolation is one of the strongest risk factors for abuse. So think about that for a moment. Not age, illness, income, but isolation. The fewer meaningful connections someone has, the more vulnerable they become. When no one visits, no one notices. When no one calls, no one asks questions. When no one is paying attention, harmful situations can continue for months or even years. This is one of the reasons I believe belonging is not simply a nice idea. Belonging is protection. Belonging creates visibility and accountability. Belonging means someone notices when something changes or when someone asks, "Are you okay?" It also looks like someone just showing up, and sometimes that simple act of showing up can change everything. The third thing many people don't know, which may surprise you the most, many victims of elder abuse actively protect the person harming them. Now that sounds impossible until you understand why. Some fear losing their only remaining relationship. Some worry about retaliation. Some depend on the abuser for transportation, housing, medication, or even daily care. Some don't want their children or grandchildren to get into trouble, and some are simply afraid of being completely alone. Think about how powerful that fear must be, to endure mistreatment because loneliness feels even worse. It's not just a story about abuse. That's a story about belonging. That's a story about human connection, and it's one of the reasons this issue deserves far more attention than it receives. Now, over the past several months, I've spent a lot of time thinking and speaking about a concept I call shrinking. When people hear that word, they often think about physical changes that come with aging. They think about posture, mobility, or maybe even health. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something much more subtle. I'm talking about what happens when a person slowly begins to take up less space in the world. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens one missed invitation at a time. One phone call that doesn't come, one friend who moves away, one spouse who passes away, one retirement party that becomes the last time coworkers gather around. Maybe it's one church service missed because driving became difficult, one family gathering where everyone was too busy to really talk. Before long, someone who was once at the center of a community finds themselves standing quietly at the edge of it. I think about the older adults I've met over the years. Teachers who taught generations of children, parents who spent years sitting in bleachers, attending recitals, helping with homework, and making sure everyone else got where they needed to go. These are people whose lives mattered, people whose stories mattered, and people who still matter. Yet somewhere along the way, many begin receiving a message from society. The message is rarely spoken out loud, but it's felt. It sounds something like this: your contribution is over. Your best years are behind you. Step aside and let someone else take over. It's a dangerous message because human beings were never designed to be invisible. We're wired for connection. We're built for community. We need purpose. We need relationships. We need to know that our presence still matters. When those things begin to disappear, something changes inside us. The world gets smaller, conversations get shorter, confidence fades. People stop reaching out because they're tired of feeling like a burden. They stop sharing because they assume nobody wants to listen. They stop participating because they have convinced themselves they no longer belong. And that is what I talk about when I say shrinking. While shrinking itself is not abuse, it creates the conditions where abuse can flourish. People who feel invisible are less likely to speak up. People who feel forgotten are less likely to report concerns. People who feel disconnected are more likely to tolerate situations they should have never have to tolerate. That is why conversations about elder abuse cannot begin and end with reporting procedures. They must include belonging. They must include connection, community. Preventing abuse is not only about stopping harm, it's about making sure people never become invisible in the first place. Now, over the years, I've come to believe that the most dangerous sentence an older adult can say is not necessarily, "I'm being abused." Often it is something much quieter. It's the sentence, "I don't want to bother anyone." Have you ever noticed how older adults say that? They say things like, I know everyone is busy, or I don't want to be a burden. Oh, I'll be fine. On the surface, those words sound polite and considerate. Underneath them, however, is often a painful reality. Many older adults have spent decades taking care of everyone else. They were the problem solvers, the caregivers, the providers, and the protectors. Asking for help feels unfamiliar. Sometimes it even feels uncomfortable. So instead of reaching out, they stay silent. Instead of asking for support, they struggle alone. And instead of sharing concerns, they convince themselves they'll figure it out somehow. The problem is that silence creates opportunities for harm. Silence allows loneliness to grow. Silence allows depression to deepen, and it allows exploitation to continue. Silence also allows people to disappear. One of the most powerful things we can do is create environments where older adults don't feel like a burden. Imagine what would happen if every older adult knew they were wanted and not just merely tolerated. Imagine if they knew their stories mattered, or their opinions mattered, or their presence made a difference. If every community made it clear that aging does not reduce someone's value. Because the truth is, we need them. We need their experiences, their perspective, the lessons they've learned. We need their wisdom. One of the greatest mistakes society makes is treating aging as a process of losing value. In reality, aging often creates value that can only be earned through experience. You can't rush wisdom, can't shortcut perspective, and you definitely cannot manufacture the lessons that come from surviving difficult lessons of life. Yet many of the people carrying those lessons feel forgotten. Perhaps that is why elder abuse awareness is not only about protecting older adults, it's about changing how we see them, not as people who used to matter, but as people who still do. Now, if you're listening today, you might be wondering, what can you actually do? After all, most of us aren't investigators. Most of us aren't social workers, and most of us are not law enforcement officers. But every one of us can become a person who notices, and noticing matters more than you think. Call someone, visit someone, ask someone to lunch, ask about their stories, their childhood, their first job. What have they learned about life? Ask what they wish more people understood. And then listen, really listen. Put your phone down, stop texting, just listen. One of the greatest gifts we can give another human being is our attention. Not because our attention solves every problem, but because attention communicates value. It says, I see you, you matter, and you belong. Imagine how different our communities would look if every older adult had 3 people who checked on them regularly. Imagine if every neighborhood adopted a culture of connection. If every church, community center, senior center, and family intentionally created opportunities for meaningful relationships. Abuse thrives in isolation. Belonging thrives in connection. We get to choose which one grows. Sometimes that choice begins with something as simple as a phone call, not because we have to, but because we care. Community is not built through grand gestures. It's built through ordinary moments repeated consistently over time. A conversation, a visit, a shared meal, maybe a ride to an appointment. Something as simple as a birthday card, or maybe a simple reminder that someone is not alone. Those small actions may seem insignificant, but for someone who feels forgotten, they can mean everything. They can be the difference between shrinking and belonging. They can be the difference between isolation and connection, and sometimes they can even be the difference between safety and harm. Now, before we wrap up today, I want to tell you a little bit about the work we're doing through Bridging Success. One of the things I've become increasingly passionate about is helping organizations understand that senior bullying is real, isolation is real, and belonging matters. We work with senior living communities, healthcare organizations, nonprofits, and community groups to help staff recognize the signs that someone may be struggling, being excluded, or maybe becoming invisible. Through workshops, professional development training, keynote presentations, and consulting, we help organizations create cultures where people feel seen, respected, and even valued. Because here's what I've learned: abuse often grows where connection is missing. Belonging is one of the most powerful protective factors that we have. And this is the problem where the solution may begin with just one person deciding the bar is too low if we're not actively trying to improve the lives of every person we serve. One person can start that conversation. One person can raise awareness, and one person can create change. So I'd like to ask for your help. If you know someone who makes decisions about staff training, professional development, resident engagement, or organizational culture, please share Bridging Success with them. Our website is bridgingsuccess.com, or reach out to me at brian@bridgingsuccess.com. Bryan is spelled Bryan, so brian@bridgingsuccess.com. Together, we can help create communities where older adults are not only safe, but truly seen, valued, and connected. I would love to discuss how we can work together to strengthen your organization and create a healthier place to live and work for everyone. Now, as we come to the end of today's conversation, I want to leave you with one final thought. Elder abuse is not simply a problem to be solved. It's a reminder of something deeper about what it means to be human. Every one of us wants to know that we matter and that we are seen. Everyone wants to know that our lives have value. The older adults in our communities are no different. The tragedy of elder abuse is not only the harm that is done, it's the message that it sends. It tells people they are disposable, they are forgotten, they no longer matter. But that message is a lie. The woman sitting alone in a nursing home has a lifetime of stories worth hearing. The gentleman who quietly attends church every Sunday has wisdom that can only be earned through decades of living. The widow who rarely leaves her home still has dreams, memories, fears, and even hopes that deserve to be honored. The grandfather sitting quietly in the corner of a family gathering is still the same man who once worked long hours, carried responsibilities, solved problems, and loved his family fiercely. Their value did not expire because they got older. Their worth did not diminish because their hair turned gray. The importance did not disappear because the world became busier. Perhaps one of the greatest gifts we can give another human being is to remind them of that truth. Now, as we recognize World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, I hope we do more than raise awareness. I hope we raise our attention. I hope we become people who notice, people who check in, who listen, who make room at the table, people who create belonging. Because when people belong, they're less likely to disappear. When people belong, they're less likely to be forgotten or more likely to be protected. In a world that often moves too fast, maybe one of the most important things we can do is slow down long enough to truly see one another. Now, before you go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Think about an older adult who made a difference in your life. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, teacher, neighbor, coach, or a friend. Think about the person who taught you something you'll never forget and encouraged you when you were struggling, believed in you when you doubted yourself, or simply showed up when it mattered most. This week, if they're still here, reach out to them. Give them a call. Send them a message. Stop by for a visit. Tell them what they meant to you. Tell them something you learned from them. Or tell them why you're grateful. And if they've passed on, tell their story. Share a memory. Pass along a lesson they taught you. Keep a piece of them alive through the stories you tell. Check out our website, bridgingsuccess.com, and just make yourself aware of the different services that we offer, and then reach out to us through the Contact Us link on the website. Let's spend this week celebrating the people whose wisdom, kindness, and guidance helped make us who we are today. Every story shared is another reminder that none of us gets through life alone. And just remember, belonging is not something we age out of. The need to be seen, valued, respected, and loved does not disappear at 60, 70, 80, or even 90 years old. If anything, it becomes even more important. Every person you pass has a story. Every older adult you encounter has lived through triumphs, heartbreaks, celebrations, losses, and lessons you may never fully know. So, until next time, take care of yourself and take care of those around you. The Acceptance Project podcast is a production of Bridging Success, LLC. To learn more about the podcast and our work, please visit bridgingsuccess.com. This podcast and its contents are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. I'm Dr. Bryan Gross, but I'm not a licensed therapist. The topics and opinions shared by me and any guests are our own and should not replace professional or medical advice. If you're seeking mental health support, medical guidance, or help with personal matters, please reach out to a licensed professional who can provide the individual support you need.